When the sun finally set on the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, it did not go down in a blaze of glory, but in silence, crumbling piece by piece under the weight of time, invasion, and internal decay. The mighty institutions that once commanded legions and governed vast territories vanished almost overnight. Roads once patrolled by imperial guards were left abandoned, cities emptied, and laws that once echoed through marble halls faded into whispers. In the vacuum of collapsing order, local populations turned inward, away from distant capitals, and toward any nearby figure who could offer them safety. And in that moment of desperation, a new order began to take shape, not one decreed by emperors, but one born from necessity. Across what had been the Roman provinces, powerful landowners began to rise, not as monarchs, but as anchors in a world that had become dangerously unstable. These men were not chosen by divine right or popular vote. They were simply the ones with the land, the weapons, and the means to defend a village from the chaos that now roamed freely. What emerged was not a system imposed from above, but one woven from below, slowly, organically, and almost invisibly. Historians like Elizabeth Brown argue that what we now call feudalism was never announced or invented. It evolved, like ivy creeping up a crumbling wall, born from older systems like the Roman colonus and Germanic tribal bonds. The fall of the centralized Roman bureaucracy meant that someone had to step in. Someone had to resolve disputes, to organize defenses, to decide what was fair and what was not. In place of governors and magistrates, local lords assumed those roles, military, judicial, administrative, all wrapped into one. They became judges, protectors, and rulers of the lands around them. No single moment defined this shift. No single document declared a new age. But as the old world vanished, this new structure, personal, fragmented, and deeply tied to land, took root. It was the early skeleton of what would later be known as feudal society. And though its bones were rough and uneven, it was strong enough to carry Europe through the darkness that lay ahead. Beneath the surface of medieval society, where kings wore crowns of gold and peasants worked soil as old as time, there lay a structure far more intricate than it appeared, a delicate web woven through loyalty, land, and ritual. At the heart of this system stood a ceremony both symbolic and binding, the act of homage and the oath of loyalty. Picture the moment. A lone knight kneels before a seated lord, hands clasped in surrender and trust. No contracts, no ink, just words, spoken aloud, carrying the weight of life, land, and legacy. The vassal pledges his unwavering service and receives, in return, the promise of protection and a grant of land, a territory called a fief. This land was not merely dirt and grass, it was survival. It was power. It was a place to build, to rule, and to pass on. Above them all stood the king, a figure cloaked in ceremonial ownership of every piece of land within the realm. But true control was fragmented. The king distributed vast tracts to his most trusted nobles, dukes, counts, barons, each bound by oath to serve him. These nobles, in turn, granted portions of their own lands to loyal knights, forging a descending chain of allegiance. And so the pyramid formed, not with bricks, but with bonds. At its peak, royal authority. At its base, the hands of thousands who tilled the earth and gave shape to daily life. The land flowed downward, but loyalty flowed upward, rising like smoke from chimney to throne. This was not a cold hierarchy, it was a living organism. Each level relied on the one below, the knight on his vassals, the baron on his knights, the king on all. In return for land, knights owed military service, lords provided justice, peasants gave labor. It was a system where law and survival were not enforced by distant rulers, but negotiated face to face, sealed with oaths that echoed through generations. This web of dependency, fueled by honor and fear, was what held medieval Europe together when empires had long fallen and maps meant little. It was a world where your word, once given, could not be broken, and your land, once lost, could cost you everything. Beyond the grand halls of castles and the oaths exchanged between lords and knights, another system quietly shaped the rhythm of medieval life, one built not on titles or swords, but on soil, seasons, and survival. This was manorialism, the engine that powered the feudal world. While feudalism dictated who ruled and who served, manorialism defined how people lived, worked, and ate. Each estate, known as a manor, was more than just land. It was a miniature world, complete with the lord's house, scattered villages, cultivated fields, meadows, woodlands, and shared resources like mills and ovens. The manor was self-sufficient by necessity. Roads were treacherous, markets distant, and coinage rare. Everything a person needed, grain, shelter, justice, was expected to be found within the manor's boundaries. At the heart of this system were the peasants, who came in two forms: free tenants and bonded workers. The bonded workers, known as serfs, were not enslaved, but neither were they truly free. They could not leave the manor without permission, could not own the land they farmed, and were bound to provide labor several days a week on the lord's own fields. In addition, they owed taxes in kind, delivering a share of their harvest or livestock to the manor's stores. By contrast, the free peasants, often called villeins, held more rights. They paid rent, sometimes in labor and sometimes in goods, but they could own property and move more freely. Yet even they depended on the lord's protection, especially in times of drought, banditry, or invasion. Manorialism brought structure to chaos. In a Europe fractured by war, famine, and political instability, the manor provided predictability. Every season had its duties: planting, harvesting, repairing, and every villager had a role. The lord oversaw justice, defended the lands, and sometimes even held church services. In return, he fed his people, offered security, and upheld the fragile peace. It was a closed circuit of mutual obligation, both oppressive and essential. This was not a world of ambition. It was a world of endurance, where survival was earned with calloused hands and silent resilience. And while kings waged wars far away, the manor remained the quiet heartbeat of medieval Europe. Though feudalism is often pictured as a single, towering structure of lords, knights, and peasants stretching across all of Europe, the truth is far more complex. This was not a system cast in stone. It bent, morphed, and adapted to the soil and spirit of each region it touched. In the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, for instance, a unique class known as the ministeriales emerged. These individuals were not born into nobility. In fact, many were legally unfree, yet they rose to serve as administrators, warriors, and landholders, carrying out the roles typically reserved for nobles. Bound to their lords by duty rather than bloodline, they managed castles, collected taxes, and led troops, proving that even within a rigid hierarchy, the lines of power could blur. Further south, in Italy, feudalism fractured into 1,000 splinters. Instead of wide swaths of land ruled by a central monarch, the peninsula was dotted with micro-suzerainties, tiny pockets of authority carved out by ambitious nobles, wealthy families, or city-states. Venice, Florence, and Genoa operated as independent republics with their own laws, armies, and foreign policies, often bypassing feudal norms entirely. Here, trade and commerce challenged the land-based economy of traditional feudalism, giving rise to merchant elites and political councils that ruled in place of kings and dukes. These hybrid models blended feudal loyalty with urban independence, creating a rich tapestry of governance unlike anything in the north. Amid this variation, one power remained constant and towering: the church. Far more than a spiritual guide, the medieval church was one of the greatest landowners in Europe. Bishops and abbots, draped in robes rather than armor, ruled over vast territories. But they were not above the feudal code. Like secular lords, they received fiefs from kings and nobles, pledged loyalty, and performed many of the same duties, administering justice, collecting rents, and managing estates. In many regions, the church acted as a parallel government, offering sanctuary, law, and even diplomacy. It was not uncommon for a single village to owe allegiance both to a noble and to a monastery nearby. This spiritual authority, grounded in wealth and land, made the church one of the most powerful and sometimes most feared forces within the feudal world. By the 11th century, the landscape of medieval Europe was shifting once more, not through sudden collapse, but through a quiet unraveling of centralized control. In northern France, a profound transformation took root, later referred to by historians as the Feudal Revolution. But this was no rebellion with banners or swords. Instead, it was a gradual splintering of royal authority, as local lords gained increasing independence from the distant throne. Castles began to rise like stone islands across the countryside, each one a seat of power unto itself. Lords minted their own coins, raised their own troops, and enforced their own justice. What once had been a kingdom with a single heart now pulsed with 1,000 smaller beats, each tied to the authority of a land-holding noble rather than a central crown. This new pattern would not stay confined to France. When William, known as the Conqueror, crossed the English Channel in 1066 and claimed the throne of England, he did more than win a crown, he reshaped an entire kingdom. After his victory at the Battle of Hastings, William systematically divided the conquered land into fiefs, granting them to his most loyal Norman barons. These men, in turn, swore fealty directly to the king, bypassing traditional layers of allegiance. It was a calculated move to cement control, but it also planted deep feudal roots into English soil. From castles to courtrooms, the structure of power was now unmistakably feudal, with loyalty and land fused together in iron-bound oaths. Yet with power came complications. As generations passed, fiefs were divided, sold, or inherited in ways that threatened the coherence of the system. Lords granted land to vassals who then attempted to grant it again, often without oversight or loyalty to the original chain. This layering of claims and allegiances created a tangle of overlapping rights, obligations, and confusion. In an effort to tame the chaos, laws were introduced, most notably the Quia Emptors Statute in 1290. This royal decree forbade subinfeudation, meaning no new layers of vassalage could be added below existing ones. Instead, when land was sold, the new holder would owe service directly to the same lord as the seller had. It was a legal measure meant to rein in feudal abuse, to freeze the pyramid in place before it toppled under its own weight. And while it did not reverse the fragmentation of power, it marked the beginning of a slow, deliberate shift back towards centralized authority. By the 14th century, the mighty framework of feudalism, once the backbone of medieval life, began to tremble under the weight of unstoppable change. It did not fall all at once, and it was not brought down by any single sword. Instead, it was a series of slow, shattering blows that shook its foundations. The first and perhaps most devastating was the arrival of the Black Death. Sweeping across Europe like a shadow between 1347 and 1351, the plague claimed the lives of nearly half the population. Entire villages vanished. Fields lay fallow. The balance of power between lord and laborer began to tilt. For the first time in centuries, land was plentiful, and workers were few. Serfs, once tied to the land and bound by custom, now found themselves in a position to negotiate. Some fled, others demanded wages, and many simply refused to accept the old order as unchangeable truth. The ruling class, unsettled by this newfound defiance, attempted to reinforce traditional bonds, but the tide was already turning. In 1381, the English countryside erupted in revolt. Tens of thousands of peasants, fueled by economic hardship and resentment toward heavy taxation, marched on London. Though the rebellion was eventually crushed, its echoes could not be silenced. Across Europe, similar uprisings challenged the legitimacy of feudal dues and questioned the divine right of noble authority. At the same time, the Hundred Years' War between England and France redefined the nature of warfare and governance. As monarchs raised standing armies and claimed stronger control over national identity, the old reliance on feudal levies diminished. Power that had once rested in scattered castles began to coalesce in royal courts. Urban life also surged forward. Cities grew in both size and influence, becoming centers of trade, craft, and learning. Merchants and guilds began to accumulate wealth and status, rivaling even the nobility. This economic transformation loosened the grip of land as the only source of power. Documents like the Magna Carta, signed in 1215 but gaining renewed relevance, set legal boundaries on what lords and kings could demand. They introduced the idea, still fragile but rising, that authority could be challenged, limited, and defined by law. Feudalism, born from a need for local security, was slowly giving way to a new world of centralized rule, social mobility, and contractual rights. And though its shadow would linger for centuries, the system that once ruled Europe was fading into history, piece by piece, like the crumbling stones of a forgotten fortress. Though the castles still stood and the titles still echoed through marble halls, by the late 18th century, feudalism in France was already a ghost, present in name, but fading fast in spirit. The social order that had once bound lords and peasants in a tight chain of duty and obedience had grown brittle, worn thin by centuries of change. Trade had flourished, cities had expanded, and the rise of the Enlightenment had cast a new light on old traditions. Yet in the countryside, traces of the medieval system lingered like ivy on a crumbling wall. Peasants still paid dues to landowners. Tithes to the church remained a burden. Privileges passed through noble bloodlines still held legal weight, even as the world outside their estates began to shift. But the winds of revolution were gathering, and soon they would blow the last stones of feudalism from their ancient place. The night of August 4th, 1789, would mark a turning point unlike any before it. As France stood on the edge of transformation, the National Assembly met under mounting pressure from widespread unrest, hunger, and the storming of the Bastille just weeks earlier. What began as a political session quickly became something far more profound. In a sweeping series of declarations, the Assembly abolished the seigneurial rights that had governed rural life for centuries. No more could lords demand payment for using communal mills. No more could tithes be collected for church coffers. No more could noble privilege dictate the fate of the common man. The legal backbone of feudalism, long brittle and strained, snapped in a single night. The words spoken in that chamber did what swords and fires had not. They formally ended a system that had defined Europe for over 1,000 years. But this was more than legal reform. It was a symbolic severing of the chains that had bound generations. For peasants, it meant freedom not just from taxes, but from humiliation. For merchants and craftsmen, it meant a step toward a society based on merit, not birth. For France as a whole, it signaled the birth of a new order, one where liberty, equality, and fraternity were not just ideals, but principles written into the foundation of the nation. The revolution did not simply destroy the past. It declared for the world to hear that the medieval world was gone. And though the path forward would be tumultuous, the feudal age had at last come to its end. Not with a collapse, but with a vote, a voice, and a vision of something entirely new.